The silence in the White Room was heavier than chains. She, dressed in her simple hospital uniform, kept her hands clasped in her lap as if they were her only anchor amidst the chaos. Her lost gaze betrayed endless nights, days when her sanity was questioned not by reality, but by the cruelty of those who had sworn to protect her. Meanwhile, far away, he believed he had solved his problem by locking her in that place. The business world continued to spin, and his arrogance led him to believe her voice would never echo beyond the padded walls. But time, relentless, reveals truths in unexpected ways. What he never imagined was that the innocent heart he cherished most would be the key to unlocking the door of guilt. The child, with her undeniable purity, didn't carry the weight of lies, nor did she understand the power games. He only knew there was a painful absence in her life. When he finally crossed the cold hospital door and saw his mother standing before him, fragile, vulnerable, but still full of tenderness in her eyes, something broke in him. The innocent gesture of pointing at her, as if demanding answers, pierced his chest like no accusation could. The conference room, the contracts, the cold numbers in reports, nothing made sense in the face of the devastating simplicity of that request. I want to see my mother. No justification could erase the abyss he had created. No excuse could restore the stolen years. Regret came not like thunder, but like a constant whisper, reminding him that the deepest wound lay not in the woman he had imprisoned, but in the heart of his own son. And faced with this innocent mirror, the inevitable question arose: how can one rebuild bonds that have been shattered by one's own ambition? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, like it, and share it so more people can learn about this exciting journey. Han Jae-won had always been described as a man of imposing presence. His name echoed in the skyscrapers of Gangnam, where his company dominated the technology market with ambitious projects and million-dollar contracts. In the eyes of society, he was an example of discipline, intelligence, and success. But at home, the walls that reflected luxury hid a cold and calculating temperament. There was no room for spontaneous smiles or gestures of tenderness. For him, everything had to be under control, even the emotions of those around him. He was the kind of man who believed that love was weakness and that obedience was the only acceptable form of coexistence. Beside him was Seo Hye-jin, the woman who once believed that the power of love could transform even the most hardened hearts. The daughter of a traditional Busan family, she had grown up amidst simple values, cultivating the hope of building a home filled with respect and harmony. When she married Jae-won, she believed she had found not just a husband, but a protector, someone who would provide stability and security. However, as the years passed, she realized that instead of protection, she had received surveillance. Instead of affection, indifference. And where she had dreamed of finding a safe haven, she had discovered an emotional prison. Between them stood Min-jun, a boy who didn't yet grasp the complexities of the adult world, but who silently felt the weight of his mother's absence and his father's harshness. His eyes shone with a mixture of innocence and unease, as if he sensed something was wrong. His childhood wasn't filled with happy family memories, but with long silences at the dinner table and nights when his mother cried softly, believing no one could hear. This triad formed the core of a story marked by contrasts. The man who had everything, but didn't know how to love. The woman who had love in abundance, but wasn't appreciated. And the child who only wanted to unite the two, without understanding that it was already too late to mend the cracks. And while the city outside pulsed with neon, noise and haste, inside that house reigned an invisible tension, on the verge of becoming unbearable. The story of Han Jae-won Seo Hye-jin and Min-jun was not just a portrait of a Korean family, but a mirror of so many lives in which silence speaks louder than words. However, what seemed like just the cold routine of an unhappy marriage was about to turn into something much more painful, as the first signs of a toxic relationship began to reveal themselves, and the line between love and suffering became increasingly blurred. The first signs of wear and tear appeared almost imperceptibly, like small cracks in a seemingly solid wall. At first, they were just sidelong glances, curt responses, and an absence of affectionate words. Han Jae-won spent less and less time at home, justifying himself with unavoidable appointments, business dinners, and urgent trips. When he returned, he carried with him the weight of stress and the coldness of someone who saw home not as a refuge, but as an extension of the corporate battlefield. Seo Hye-jin, still believing that love could rescue their relationship, devoted herself to every detail. She prepared breakfast, straightened his tie, and meticulously tended the house, hoping that some gesture would be enough to break his icy shell. But nothing seemed to touch her husband's heart. He sat at the table, his eyes fixed on his cell phone, as if her presence were invisible. A simple "good morning" was met with silence, or at most a vague nod. Arguments began to escalate. Small flaws became grounds for disproportionate outbursts. If dinner was late, he would harshly criticize. If her outfit wasn't impeccable, a sharp comment would make her feel worthless. Hye-jin, stifled, tried to argue, but quickly gave in to her husband's firm, authoritative voice. And so, the home, which should have been a haven, became a minefield where any misstep could trigger a new wave of coldness or contempt. Min-jun, even at a young age, sensed the tense atmosphere. Sitting on the floor with his toys, he listened to the interrupted conversations, the weary sighs, and the silences more painful than any scream. His mother, still with her sweet gaze, tried to hide it, but her teary eyes betrayed the weight she carried. The boy, without fully understanding, only knew something was wrong, and that his mother's smile was slowly fading. Little by little, what began as subtle gestures of indifference became routine. Jae-won didn't accompany her to family events, didn't ask how her day was, and showed no interest in anything other than his own ego and the empire he ruled. To him, Hye-jin had ceased to be a wife and companion, becoming merely someone expected to fulfill expectations without question. The poison of contempt slowly seeped into the walls of that luxurious house, and with each passing day, the distance between them grew wider. She still believed she could save her marriage, but she was beginning to realize that her hope was colliding with an insurmountable barrier. And when the indifference stopped being just a private pain and became public, the humiliation in front of others showed that the abyss was about to swallow everything, revealing an even crueler side of the man she called her husband. The dinner in Gangnam had been perfectly planned. The restaurant's lights reflected off crystal glasses. The sophisticated aroma of Korean cuisine mingled with the sound of discreet conversations, and the atmosphere seemed to exude power. It was an important night for Han Jae-won's business, and he, as always, had demanded Seo Hye-jin be present, not to share in his achievements, but to fulfill her role as wife to an influential man. Hye-jin, though anxious, prepared herself carefully. The navy blue dress she wore fell elegantly, and her hair tied in a discreet bun reflected the delicacy of her personality. She silently believed that perhaps this was an opportunity to get closer to her husband, to show herself as part of the world he valued so much. She sat beside him, struggling to smile at the executives who watched her with curiosity and restrained respect. However, when the conversation turned to complex topics of market strategy, one of the attendees gently addressed her, asking her opinion. Hye-jin responded naturally, mentioning that she believed the success of any company wasn't based solely on numbers, but also on solid human relationships. It was a simple statement, born from her intuition and experience, but to Jae-won, it felt like an insult. He leaned forward, his voice firm and sharp as a blade. "You don't understand business at all. Just smile and keep quiet." Awkwardness fell over the table like a heavy curtain. The executives averted their eyes. Some stifled coughs, others stirred their glasses, trying to hide their discomfort. Hye-jin, her face flushed, looked down at the plate in front of her. The food, once appetizing, now seemed an impossible burden to swallow. That scene marked a wound that would not heal easily. It wasn't just the coldness at home, but the exposure of her fragility in front of strangers. For the first time, she realized that her husband didn't hesitate to destroy her dignity in public to reassert his authority. Minutes later, the evening continued, but the bitter taste of that humiliation lingered far beyond dinner. Hye-jin held onto her silence like armor, but inside a part of her was beginning to shatter. And if in front of strangers he was able to treat her like a disposable object, what would happen when the control went beyond the walls of the house and began to dominate every aspect of her life? After that night in Gangnam, the invisible barriers Han Jae-won had already imposed at home became increasingly visible and suffocating. He no longer saw his wife as a companion, but as someone who needed to be kept under constant surveillance. Seo Hye-jin's cell phone became his control. He checked messages, calls, even the times of missed calls, as if every detail of her life were a company report requiring auditing. Visits to his family in Busan were prohibited on the grounds that it wasn't good for the company's image for his wife to spend so much time away from the capital. Meetings with childhood friends became rare, as he claimed they were bad influences who didn't understand the life of a woman married to someone of his standing. Even short outings, like walking in the park or visiting a cafe, required his permission. Hye-jin, who had always been free and spontaneous, began to feel the weight of living in a gilded cage. The days were long and silent in the immense apartment, decorated with furniture that gleamed with sophistication, but seemed even colder in the face of her solitude. She took refuge in small details, watering plants that almost no one noticed, tidying drawers repeatedly, cooking dishes that he ultimately ignored. Every simple gesture became a desperate attempt to find meaning. Amidst the emptiness, her relationship with Min-jun also became controlled. Jae-won dictated schedules and set strict rules for how the boy should be raised, as if even maternal bonding were an area where he had the right to impose rules. Hye-jin, with a heavy heart, silently obeyed, but deep down she knew she was being ripped away little by little from her very essence as a mother. The words that had once been filled with contempt now took on a tone of command. For Jae-won, this wasn't about partnership, but about command. He believed that love was synonymous with obedience and that respect was the same as unquestioning submission. With each passing day, her freedom slipped away, like sand slipping through her fingers, and the shadow of a crueler fate loomed. The city around her remained vibrant, neon lights flashing on Seoul's bustling streets, but for Hye-jin, everything felt distant. On the outside, she was the perfect wife of the powerful CEO. On the inside, a silent prisoner, who no longer knew how much more she could endure. And it was precisely when she believed that nothing could hurt more than that suffocating isolation that life presented her with a devastating test. A crucial moment in which she hoped to find support in her husband, but received only the most cutting indifference. Winter in Seoul always carried a different weight for Seo Hye-jin. The streets adorned with Christmas lights, the cafes crowded with couples warming their hands over steaming cups, and the distant sound of festive music contrasted with the silent darkness she carried within. It was during this time, when the city seemed to breathe hope, that her world crumbled with the news of her father's death in Busan. Hyejin had always found her father a safe haven. He was the man who taught her to value simplicity, the importance of respect, and the strength of dignity. Receiving the call confirming his departure was like feeling the ground give way beneath her feet. Tears flowed uncontrollably, and her heart felt crushed under an unbearable weight. What she needed at that moment wasn't luxury or material comfort, but a hug, a word of support, a gesture that showed she wasn't alone. But Han Jae-won, upon hearing the news, remained impassive. His cold expression, devoid of any trace of compassion, was more painful than the loss itself. He offered no comfort, held her hand, or showed any empathy. He simply closed his laptop, as if his wife's grief were yet another inconvenient interruption to his business routine. When she begged him to accompany her to the funeral, pleading with a choked voice, he received only a sharp reply. "Go alone. I have an important meeting in Seoul. This kind of thing can't interfere with my schedule." Those words echoed in her mind like a hammer. The pain of losing her father mingled with the even more cruel pain of realizing that the man she had chosen to share her life with was incapable of offering the slightest bit of humanity. Even so, she dressed in black and left for Busan, accompanied only by the memories of her father and the silence of her husband. At the funeral, as family and friends embraced her with tears in their eyes, she felt the emptiness beside her. The space that should have been occupied by the companion she had chosen to be with at all times. And in that empty space, the cold seemed even more piercing. Days later, when he returned to Seoul, the atmosphere between them was even more tense. Jae-won, irritated by what he called emotional dramas, decided to take extreme action. Claiming that his wife was unstable, that her crying fits and sensitivity could tarnish the family's image, he ordered her admitted to a psychiatric hospital in Incheon. The shock was immediate. Hyejin, still weakened by the loss of her father, had no strength to fight the decision. The feeling of abandonment turned to despair when she realized her husband didn't see her pain as something human, but as a nuisance to be pushed away. Her cold signature on the hospitalization papers was proof that, in his eyes, she had ceased to be a wife and had become a burden. As the hospital doors closed behind her, the last thing she remembered was her son's face, sleeping peacefully at home, unaware that his mother was being ripped from his life. Her heart shattered silently, and even amidst the white walls and clinical gazes, what destroyed her most was the memory of the indifference of the man who had once promised to protect her. But fate still had an even crueler scene in store, a moment in which all the accumulated pain would reach its highest point, revealing how far a woman can be taken when love turns into abandonment and marriage into a prison. That night in Incheon, the sky was covered in dense clouds, and a fine rain dripped down the windows of the psychiatric hospital like silent tears that accompanied the confined patients. In the cold, white lamplit room, Seo Hyejin sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her trembling hands clutching the rough fabric of her uniform. The smell of disinfectant permeated the air, and every distant sound of slamming doors or hurried footsteps echoed as a reminder that she was trapped in a place she never chose. Hours earlier, she had pleaded in every way. She wept before her husband, begging for understanding, asking only to stay with her son. Her tear-filled eyes reflected true love, but also deep despair, the fear of being forgotten. And as her voice broke with pleas, Han Jae-won remained impassive, pen firmly in hand, signing the documents that sealed her fate. "Please, I just need my family. Don't leave me here." Her voice still echoed in the hallway when she was taken away by the nurses. Outside, the contrast was devastating. Min-jun slept in his room, hugging his worn-out rag doll, oblivious to the unfolding tragedy. The boy breathed calmly, dreaming of his mother, while she, in a cold, unfamiliar room, struggled to keep alive. The hope that he would still remember her affection, her lullabies, her warm embraces. In that narrow bed, Hyejin felt her soul shatter. There were no longer enough tears to convey the weight of being betrayed not only as a wife, but as a mother. Jae-won's birthday cake, which had still sat untouched at home days before, had become a cruel symbol of her loneliness. The love she offered was ignored, tossed aside, as if it were worthless. The days began to drag on in a mechanical routine. The bland food served on metal trays, the brief conversations with indifferent doctors, the locked windows that only allowed glimpses of the grey sky. Every detail was a reminder that, to the man she had dedicated her life to, she was no longer more than a nuisance, a burden that needed to be hidden. And yet, it was in that arid environment that the pain reached its peak. The image of Min-jun, smiling innocently, began to haunt her thoughts constantly. She clung to that memory like a castaway clings to a plank in the middle of the ocean. But the more she remembered her son, the more her despair intensified, for with each day away from him, she felt the connection weaken. On the same night that marked the first week of her hospitalization, Hyejin knelt on the cold floor of her room. Her knees ached against the tile, but she no longer noticed. With her hands clasped together, she murmured a desperate prayer, asking for the strength to endure what seemed unbearable. Tears flowed uncontrollably, and only one question echoed in her mind. How long would silence be her only companion? Meanwhile, in the mansion in Seoul, Jae-won ate dinner alone in silence. The plate prepared by the maid sat before him, untouched. It was as if somehow that emptiness on the table was the exact reflection of the emptiness spreading within him, even if he couldn't bring himself to admit it. The silence in that dining room was no longer just absence. It was a harbinger of something greater, something that would begin to erode his own peace. And as Hyejin's silence began to lengthen, turning into an invisible abyss, a silent shift was approaching. It wouldn't be screams nor accusations, but a deep silence that would carry within it the weight of an even more painful emotional farewell. The days in the psychiatric hospital blurred into a grey, indistinguishable sequence. Time seemed to stand still, and each morning, when the nurses opened the curtains to let in the dim winter, light, Seo Hyejin no longer reacted. Her eyes were always fixed on the same narrow window, as if searching outside for a fragment of freedom she could never attain. At first, she still tried to resist. She cried silently on the coldest nights, mentally wrote letters to her son, dreamed of the possibility that her husband would change his mind and come for her. But little by little, the remaining flame faded. There were no more tears to shed, no words to plead. What had once been despair turned into bitter resignation. She folded her uniform repeatedly, with mechanical movements, as if each crease were a way to fill the emptiness within. She sat in the cafeteria, but rarely touched her food. She observed the other patients in silence, but never attempted to speak. The world around her continued to unfold, but inside her, everything had stopped. It was as if she was saying goodbye to her own voice, her own identity. The lack of reaction became her greatest form of resistance. Not screaming, not crying, not pleading. This was the way she found to avoid offering her husband the spectacle of her pain. And paradoxically, this silence, so discreet and so profound, carried more weight than any accusation could. For Han Jae-won, who visited sporadically, the silence began to become uncomfortable. He expected to find his wife broken, crying, begging for her son. But instead, he found a distant gaze that no longer fixed on him. This unexpected indifference disarmed him in a way that even his biggest business rivals had never been able to. Gradually, her figure ceased to be the woman screaming for help and became an enigma. Someone who no longer offered him resistance or supplication. It was as if, by choosing silence, Hyejin had reclaimed something he could never control, his own soul, and it would be precisely this devastating silence that would prepare the ground for the most decisive moment, as a single innocent gesture from Minjun, full of purity and tenderness, would become the trigger that would open the CEO's eyes and put all his choices in check. In the luxurious Seoul mansion, where every corner exuded power and opulence, the silence became unbearably heavy. Han Jae-won walked the marble corridors as if haunted by invisible ghosts. The delicate sound of Hyejin's laughter echoed, nor the scent of the dishes she prepared with such care. Everything seemed overly organized, cold, sterile, as if her absence had robbed the house of its soul. It was in this empty space that Minjun, with his childlike innocence, became the voice his father refused to hear. The boy, his eyes always shining with hope, began asking increasingly insistent questions. Sometimes he would appear in the living room carrying the ragdoll, sit beside his father, and with a look filled with tenderness say, "Appa, when is Mommy coming back?" Jae-won looked away, made excuses, talked about travel or treatments, but never gave a concrete answer. Minjun, however, didn't. Give up. One winter morning, when snow covered the streets of the capital and the city seemed even quieter, the boy approached, grabbed his father's jacket sleeve, and asked with devastating simplicity, "Appa, why do you hate Mommy?" These words pierced Jae-won like a well-aimed arrow. He, who had always prided himself on mastering any situation, was left speechless. His heart raced, his hands trembled slightly, and for the first time he felt the vulnerability he had always denied. It wasn't a business rival that had defeated him, nor a public scandal. It was the purity of a child unknowingly exposing the cruelty of his own choices. He tried to respond, but his voice faltered. Minjun stared at him, waiting for an explanation that would never come. In that instant, all the scenes he had buried deep in his memory came rushing back with overwhelming force. Hyejin's pleading look in the hospital, the tears he had ignored, the cutting words he had chosen instead of comfort. Each memory was a blade cutting deep, ripping through the armor he had always worn to protect himself. The following days became unbearable. Minjun repeated the same question, always with a sweet, naive tone, but to Jae-won, it sounded like a silent judgment. Each time he heard it, he felt smaller, more powerless, as if the empire he had built was crumbling within him. The guilt, once hidden beneath the weight of arrogance, now became a burden he could no longer bear. It was then that something inside him snapped. That night, alone in his office, he looked at his desk and saw an old photo frame of Minjun on his mother's lap, both of them smiling in a Busan park. The image seemed to radiate a happiness that had vanished, and the contrast with the present was unbearable. For the first time in years, tears welled up in his eyes, not as a sign of weakness, but as the silent confession of someone finally recognizing the enormity of the mistake he had made. And yet, this painful awareness brought him not peace, but despair. He knew that the open wound would not heal easily, and that perhaps it was already too late to correct the fate he had sealed with his own hands. Driven by this anguish, he decided to face what he had been avoiding, visiting Hyejin in the hospital. What he would find, however, would not be tears or pleas, but something much more cutting, a cold indifference that would reveal how much he had lost. The morning he decided to visit the hospital in Incheon, Han Jae-won wasn't sure what to expect. The car sped along the foggy streets, but inside his mind was filled with confused memories and voices that echoed like ghosts from the past. That seemingly ordinary journey became a corridor of memories. The day he humiliated his wife in front of the employees, his daughter's frightened look during their arguments, the nights he chose power over family. He imagined finding his wife fragile, perhaps crying, perhaps begging for forgiveness. A part of him still believed he could regain control if he showed even the slightest attention, as if his mere presence were enough to rewrite the mistakes. The car parked in front of the grey building. The closed windows, the restrained movement of doctors and nurses, everything seemed to conspire to make him sense the coldness of the place even before he entered. As he walked through the reception area, the silence enveloped him almost suffocatingly. Every footstep in the silent white corridor echoed like a reminder of everything he had ignored. Nurses hurried past, patients murmured in distant voices, and the cold air weighed heavily like a constant accusation. The smell of medicine mixed with disinfectant made him feel that this space was not only physical but also symbolic, a tribunal where his sins would be read aloud, even without witnesses. Arriving at Seo Hye-jin's bedroom door, he hesitated for a few seconds, his heart pounding at a pace he hadn't felt since his youth, when he still believed in promises of love. His hand gripped the doorknob, but the strength to turn it seemed to slip away. He pushed the door open carefully, and what he saw disconcerted him. She sat by the window, her uniform neatly folded on her lap, her gaze fixed on the cloudy horizon. There were no tears, no gestures of despair. There was only silence, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow any attempt at dialogue. The scene disarmed him. It wasn't the defeated woman he'd expected to see, but a serene, almost unreachable figure. Jae-won called her name, his voice almost trembling, but she didn't move. Time seemed to stretch. Only after a few seconds did he slowly turn around, and the eyes he met weren't those of a broken woman, but of someone who no longer recognized him as an essential part of her life. They were steady, calm, yet distant, as if they'd weathered a storm and now rested on another shore, inaccessible to him. He tried to get closer, the words stumbling in his mouth. Hye-jin, I didn't want it to be like this. She watched him calmly, in no rush to respond. The prolonged silence made him uncomfortable, as if all the power he held over the world were useless in that room. And indeed it was. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but firm, carrying a truth impossible to refute. Now you know what it's like to live without someone you love. Those words hit Jae-won with devastating force. There was no shouting, no accusations, just a cold, definitive sentence. Her indifference was more painful than any direct confrontation could be. He, accustomed to facing rivals in corporate meetings and courtrooms, couldn't handle the cutting calm of that sentence. It was as if he'd received the worst sentence, that of no longer mattering. He tried to hold her hand, but she withdrew it naturally, without apparent resentment, simply with the serenity of someone closing a book they've already read. She returned her gaze to the window as if he were just another visitor, among many. In that instant, Jae-won understood he had lost something that no amount of money, no power, no belated regret could restore. It wasn't about winning back her affection, but about understanding that that affection no longer belonged to him. He left the room with a heavy heart, her words hammering like an endless echo. In the hallway, the voices of the patients and the footsteps of the nurses mingled with the dull thud of his now awakened consciousness. He walked in silence, his tie tightening more than ever, as if each knot were a reminder of his guilt. As he got back into his car, he glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror and realized he no longer saw the same man as before. In the luxurious mansion, the chandeliers glittered, the hallways gleamed, but everything seemed empty. The silence of the house was different from the silence of the hospital. There were no murmurs or hurried footsteps. There was only an echoing emptiness, reminding him of every space where her presence was missed. The cup of tea that always sat beside the sofa was gone. The soft music she loved to listen to in the mornings was gone. Even the paintings on the walls seemed colder, as if reflecting the emptiness that now inhabited her soul. At night, he tried to find solace in his work, reviewing reports and analyzing numbers. but everything seemed meaningless. With each page he turned, he remembered her gaze, serene and distant. It wasn't hatred that destroyed him, but indifference. He discovered that the opposite of love wasn't anger, but the absolute absence of feeling. Days later, while walking through the mansion, he found Hyejin's old desk. Inside a drawer, there were still unfinished letters, drafts of thoughts, and some scribbles from when she practiced writing her daughter's name. This disarmed him. He sat at the desk and stared at the sheets for hours, feeling the weight of every unspoken word, every ignored gesture. The true weight of regret lay not in the hospital room, but in the silence of his own home. It was in the mundane, everyday details that Han Jae-won would feel the harshest impact of Seo Hye-jin's absence. The soft scent that still lingered in certain corners, the emptiness beside the bed, the memory of the mornings when she offered him coffee without expecting anything in return. And in that immense solitude, he finally understood that losing business, losing allies, losing power, none of it compared to what he had truly lost. Because, in the end, it wasn't the absence of a wife that destroyed him, but the irreparable loss of being remembered as someone worthy of love. Back at the mansion in Seoul, Han Jae-won walked through the rooms with the feeling that each space reflected back at him a painful reflection. The silence was no longer just absence, it was a constant echo of the decision that had condemned him to irreversible loneliness. The living room, once vibrant with Seo Hye-jin's presence and Min Jun's shy laughter, now felt like a museum of memories, cold and immobile. The sofa where she sat to fold clothes still bore invisible marks, and the faint aroma of the tea she used to brew had vanished as if it had never existed. At the dinner table, the emptiness was even more cruel. Faced with Hyejin's untouched plate, Jae-won stood paralyzed, staring into the space as if it were an abyss impossible to cross. The steam from the freshly served food quickly dissipated, and he, unable to lift his cutlery, realized that it wasn't just the food growing cold before him, but the entire life he had once rejected. The image of his wife serving him meals with a restrained smile returned to his mind like a ghost, and the guilt became a suffocating weight that no amount of business achievement could alleviate. Walking to her bedroom, he found the vanity organized as she always left it, every perfume bottle lined up, every detail in absolute silence. The absence of her presence permeated the room, and even the simplest objects seemed to accuse him. The forgotten hairbrush, the book closed on the last page, the handkerchief folded on the nightstand. Every detail screamed the truth he had tried to deny, and Jae-won finally understood that he had lost something irreplaceable. That night, lying in the large, lonely bed, he tried to close his eyes, but the weight of memories wouldn't let him rest. Hyejin's face haunted him, not with fury or resentment, but with the serenity of someone who had already learned to live without him. This was the cruelest punishment, realizing that her love hadn't been destroyed by hatred, but transformed into indifference. And it was in this crushing silence that Han Jae-won, the man who had always believed he owned everything, discovered that some losses cannot be bought, reversed, or negotiated. Regret had come, but it had come too late. If this story touched your heart, like this video, share it with someone special, and subscribe to the channel to see more moving stories. Your participation is what motivates us to continue bringing you stories that speak of pain, hope, and redemption.